Welcome once again to the Benedictine Monastery of the Holy Cross, Rostrevor, in County Down, Northern Ireland, where we pursue our Lenten journey together. At the very heart of the message of Lent is forgiveness, the acceptance of the grace of forgiveness and the call to forgive. Forgiving and accepting ourselves as having been forgiven can be issues for many of us, and Jesus realised that, and that's why he told us an important story which grew out of a question that Peter put to him. Maybe I could begin by reading that story from the Gospel to you. Peter went up to Jesus and said, "Lord, how often must I forgive my brother if he wrongs me?" And of course Peter thought he was generous when he said, "As often as 7 times?" Jesus answered, "Not 7, I tell you, but 77 times. And he went on then to tell a parable. And so the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who decided to settle his accounts with his servants. When the reckoning began, they brought him a man who owed 10,000 talents, but he had no means of paying. So his master gave orders that he should be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions to meet the debt. At this, the servant threw himself down at his master's feet. "Give me time," he said, "and I will pay the whole sum." And the servant's master felt so sorry for him that he let him go and cancelled the debt. Now this servant, as he went out, happened to meet a fellow servant who owed him 100 denarii, much less. But he seized that man by the throat and began to throttle him. "Pay what you owe me," he said. His fellow servant fell at his feet and implored him, saying, "Give me time and I will pay you." But the other would not agree. To the contrary, he had him thrown into prison until he should pay the debt. And then we hear that the master who had let the first one off hears of this and calls him in and says, "Now you go to prison until you pay the debt you owed me." This story really is a very important story, teaching us much about forgiveness, teaching us about allowing ourselves to be forgiven, and how that engages us to be generous in mercy with others in our turn. Let's go back to what we're told in the story. The time came for the settling of accounts. I suppose, like me, you all know people who don't like the end of the tax year because they've got to settle accounts. Maybe they don't like the end of the month because they've got to pay the invoices. How many of us feel at ease with accounts being settled? I suspect many of us would prefer to shy away from this idea. We wouldn't like to be called into account ourselves. And maybe we wouldn't like the idea of having to sit down with others who are indebted to us either. Some of us can shy away from asking a debtor to pay up what is owed to us as readily as we are tempted into hiding, knowing ourselves to be in debt to another. I certainly know one man who avoids going into his home village in case he meets someone who owes his family a considerable amount of rent. He fears meeting this person, and he explained himself to me in this way: "I'm just too embarrassed about the whole thing, and I don't want to make the debtor feel even more embarrassed." When it comes to us having done wrong, being in debt to others for our wrongful actions, the challenge of listing all the people we have harmed in an examination of conscience can be a very difficult experience for us. And there are times in our lives when we really feel the need to make a moral inventory where we list all the people we have harmed and we seek forgiveness for that, maybe asking them directly, or where not possible, at least in prayer, maybe in sacramental reconciliation, asking that we be forgiven. Often this triggers off a certain amount of self-justification. However, when we draw up the list and we see all the wrong we've done, we try to justify ourselves and explain things away, as it were. We know we have done wrong, but we step into a defensive mode. We try to tone down our offence and explain it away, at least in part. Listing the people who have harmed us can also have something of the same effect, especially if we love and care for that person. How many children, even though now adults, still find it hard to admit to the ill effects of their education at home, the ill effects that the way in which their parents acted in their regard has marred their lives. How many people in a relationship will justify their partner who has done them wrong, cheated on them or whatever, not wanting to recognize just how much they have been hurt by their loved one. Of course, thoughts of harm done to us can also, and perhaps this is even more current, have the opposite effect to that which I've just described. It can have the effect of leading us to be so terribly annoyed with the person who has offended us that we become completely outraged by them. In this case, we are inclined to exaggerate their offence against us. We blow it out of all proportion. We become really embittered and terribly angry, and we do this beyond measure. Why is it so difficult for some of us to list offences, either those committed by us or those committed against us? I think one of the principal feelings we all shy away from, whatever side of the fence we are on, is the sentiment of shame. We're inclined to be ashamed of suffering, either being a cause of another person's suffering or to find ourselves suffering at another person's hands. We also fear the ill of resentment. Resentment in the literal sense of the word can really frighten us. Literally, to resent is to feel again and again and again. The word for feel in French is to sentir, and to be resentful is to feel again and again and again. To be resentful is to be full of the pain associated with something done to us in the past, and to reawaken that feeling within us over and over. Resentment is a debilitating, obsessive thought associated with a wrong done to us, or a good someone has failed to do to us. I hear a question thrown up for us in that gospel passage which has spurred today's reflection. The story of the man whose debts were forgiven and who then went and sought to have someone who owed him a little pay up. The question is this: how to deal with the resentments which are there, perhaps buried within us, and which risk to be reawakened in our hearts. Jesus' story carries within it a certain insight in this respect. The challenge presented to us by the Word of God is a challenge to look beyond ourselves to God as a source of mercy. What is important in this story is that Jesus has us move beyond looking at ourselves alone. He has us look at ourselves in relation to others under God's regard, so that we may learn from Him how to deal with others. If that guy who came out of that room where the debts were settled had stayed under the regard of the master, then he would have been more readily amenable to forgive the person who owed him the little he owed. And so today's gospel challenges us to set aside forgetfulness and to set aside the double standards that arise in our hearts when we are forgetful of all the mercy that has been shown to us. Our leniency with ourselves, our acceptance of others' leniency in our regard, and our harshness in regard to others, even for lesser offences. This is what we see being played out in that story. Sometimes, admittedly not always, we can readily accept God's forgiveness of our own sins and transgressions, even very major ones, represented in the story by that very large debt, and yet be so unforgiving in regard to lesser offences committed by some against us. The gospel story we're reflecting on calls upon us to be as generous as the one who cancelled out the large debt owed to him when it comes to every other debt in our regard. To cancel a debt means that we are actually aware of just how much is owed us. We cannot cancel a debt if we don't know what the person indebted to us actually owes us. We must know the sum. in order to be able to write it off. So many of our difficulties about writing off things that were done to us can be traced back to our inability to measure just what damage was actually incurred by the offence committed against us. When we are fully aware of the mercy shown to us, when we recognise just how much we have been forgiven, then we can begin to reflect something of that same generosity to others. That's just why it's very important for us to link together what happened in this gospel story. We are shown here how what was owed to the man, to the king, was tallied up. He was told the amount, and we are told also the amount that was owed to the second person. So we have to be aware of what we're cancelling out. And this is an example for us to follow. It's very easy to say to someone, all is forgiven, when we don't actually know all that has to be forgiven. We have to know what the person owes in order to really forgive all. When we say all, we can be saying nothing. It isn't enough just to say we forgive the wrongs done to us if we don't really know what those wrongs are. It isn't enough for us to say all our wrongs are forgiven if we don't recognise the wrongs we have committed. And that's why it's important for us to take the time we need to make that moral inventory, to see what it is we need to be forgiven of. And it's also important for us, as we seek to live this Lenten season in the spirit of forgiveness, to actually see what we need to forgive others of. The point I'm wanting to make today is this, that we must choose to forgive and to be fully aware of all that is engaged in this forgiveness process, all that is engaged in that choice. True forgiveness offered is a positive thing that both empowers and enriches us. What I've just said there about empowering and enriching must be properly understood. True forgiveness empowers us in a way that actually makes us vulnerable. It enriches us in a way that actually impoverishes us. We could say that the showing of mercy is an act of vulnerability and poverty. It comes from the poor and vulnerable heart of our God. And so too is the act of receiving mercy. The reception of mercy puts us in a vulnerable position and makes us feel poor to have to receive. Benevolence, generosity, mercy should never give the benefactor the upper hand. To reflect God's goodness should never make us feel superior. To the contrary, we should feel truly humbled to be allowed to be channels of God's grace. To forgive another is also a way to experience a deep healing within oneself. It forces the one who forgives, as much as the one who is forgiven, to really let go of what is festering within them, to let go of resentment. Let's face it, we cannot change what others have done to us. We will have been marked by that and maybe even marred by that for life. But we can write off their debts in our regard. We can forgive the wrongs, not relying on our own strength alone, but relying on the power of God's grace. Remember the Jesus prayer on the cross. He said, not looking down to those who were persecuting him, I forgive you, but he prayed, Father, forgive them. And that's what we can all do during this season of Lent. Ask the Father to do for us what we cannot do ourselves, to forgive. God is generous, rich in mercy, ever ready to forgive debts and transgressions. That's what the scriptures teach us. And he calls us to be like him. He calls us to be merciful as he is merciful. And maybe the way we can be merciful is simply to pray that prayer, Father, forgive those who have sinned against us. May we be graced to do that as we journey through this Lent, so that we may come to that freedom of heart which the Lord desires for us. The freedom that's given not only to the one forgiven, but the freedom that's given to the one who forgives. Amen.
Alleluia. At the end of Mass, we are told to go out and bring the gospel into our lives and witness to the gospel by everything that we say and do. It's so important that we are all out there bringing the joy of the gospel to everyone we know. And that's why I'm so pleased to endorse and offer my blessing to Shalom World TV for all that you are doing to bring good news into this world which is often sad and dark and in need of a message of hope. Thank you for what you're doing. May God bless your work always.